Hey everyone. So there's a pretty interesting development going on in the Deadlock community right now, so I figured we should talk about it. As of earlier this morning, Dakota from the Deadlock Tracker Discord had mentioned that basically the Deadlock Tracker project would no longer be able to scrape match data after a patch was implemented on Deadlock that prevented them from being able to do so. If you aren't familiar with Deadlock Tracker, the TLDR this is basically a website that previously would allow us to get all types of data on the game. It would give you hero, win, and pick rates. It would give you item, win, and pick rates. And if you logged in with your Steam account, you would also be able to see your own match history, your estimated MMR, you could look up other players. You could find their match history, their estimated MMR. And in general, it was just a pretty good way to keep your finger on the pulse of the game and try to feel out, how the tides were shifting with individual characters, how people's understanding of those characters was shifting as they bought new items and all that sort of stuff, right? So the question right now is, why would Valve take away the ability to scrape this data and for us to be able to look at and interpret all of this different stuff? First, I don't think it's reasonable to assume that this is a policy that's going to last through release. Valve historically has absolutely no problem with sharing data with its players. We're currently in the Dota 2 client, and you can see we can delineate by different ranks and whatnot, and we can scroll through and we can look at the different win rates of all of the various different heroes in the game, their pick percentage, their ban percentage, their win percentage, again, delineated out by rank. And even if we were to go to something like my match history and we just click on a match, see the scoreboard, all different types of graphs from when people bought items, player levels and how that progressed throughout the game, team XP, player net worth, various different damage breakdowns and all sorts of stuff. So even if we were to hop outside of the Dota 2 client and we just look at something like Dota Buff, Dota Buff also has just a whole wealth of information that is being scraped from the Dota client and being publicly shared. And this has been a resource that has existed for an incredibly long time. I believe that similar tools and utilities exist for Counter-Strike. I don't think they have as many built into their game because there aren't as many variables in Counter-Strike. It's comparatively a relatively simple game. But I do think that there is, CSGO statistics websites like this as well. So this is definitely something that is like an alpha or beta period sort of thing. So the question now is why would they have this type of policy? I think the first reason that they might be doing something like this is because they are trying to basically filter out and get exactly the type of feedback from their player base that they're looking for. So I think a website like this sort of paints everybody's perception of their various different matches and sort of informs them what they're supposed to be thinking about. For example, if we go to the Heroes tab and we see something like, 7, as of the latest data that they were able to scrape, had almost a 60% win rate and a 93% pick rate. If you happen to come to a website like this and you saw statistics like this, you would be like, wow, 7 is the most broken, overpowered character in the game, even if you never hopped into a match and you hadn't played Deadlock before in your entire life. And I think the type of feedback that a developer is looking for while they're in an alpha is less statistical based and probably more akin to is this fun to interact with? Are you enjoying playing against this or not? The other thing that I think is interesting is that, again, all of this data paints a particular type of picture, but I think people are a little bit too quick to jump to conclusions. So, for example, 7, the reason why his win rate is particularly high is because right now there are various different builds going around that focus really, really heavily on his ultimate, basically having it up and off cooldown as frequently as possible and making it do as much damage as possible. If you're familiar with his ultimate, it's a really strong teamfight utility. It just does a ton of damage and a massive AoE, and the only real thing that you can do about it is try to either CC him or try to line of sight him. In games like this, pretty much in really all competitive games, the problems are going to emerge well before the solutions to those problems are developed. So what I mean by this is it's very easy to look at an ultimate like 7 and have the idea of I want this off cooldown and I want it to do a bunch of damage. And then it takes a significant amount of time for the player base to develop solutions for this. Maybe one solution is you buy knockdown for 3k and then you just CC him every time he does it. Okay, what if he buys the item that makes him invulnerable to crowd control? Okay, maybe we want to buy an item like Blink so that we can maneuver ourselves and try to get behind, some cover. Maybe it's about where on the map we're taking the fights. Maybe there are better places to try to fight a 7. There are all different types of solutions, and the point is just that presenting a problem for a player base is going to come about a lot faster than developing the solution. And in general, problems are easier to introduce than solutions are. However, I also think there is a problem where a lot of this data was being driven not by truths about the game necessarily, and more so about I'm not trying to say this in a negative way, but a lower common denominator sort of thing. So what I mean by this is I think if we look at Grey Talon having a 46% win rate, I think that is very heavily influenced by the fact that the top rated Grey Talon builds in the Deadlock client are just not particularly good. The last time I looked and I checked in, a lot of the higher Grey Talon builds were very focused on physical damage. And I just don't think that that's the correct way to play this character. And people have started to sort of figure this stuff out, where they're like, okay, if I get a bunch of spirit items and I get a bunch of cooldown reduction, then not only do I have this one that is just a line AoE nuke that I can use to push waves, I can use to team fight, all that sort of stuff, but I also have this Owl ultimate that's off cooldown every 30 seconds. And it's basically a flying Junkrat ultimate. It soars around, you can use it to team fight in places that you're not even at. You can chase people down. You can use it to scout. You can use it to fly over to another lane, and you can burst down a wave so you can get that wave pushing without having to actually get over there. It does your taxes and mows your lawn. It walks your dog. The ultimate does the fucking everything for you if you just spec into it enough, right? So people were starting to figure this out, but because it wasn't one of the highest rated builds, because those highest rated builds were mostly physical damage, I think a lot of the players who, haven't invested tens to hundreds of hours into this game yet, who, have jobs and families and lives, we're probably just picking oh, this is highly rated, it's probably good, and then losing their matches and not doing particularly great. So I think, again, this type of data just paints pictures that are probably not actually useful to the type of data that we're trying to get. Another thing is that these websites, there are a couple like them, but I mean, this is probably the best one, so we'll just keep talking about Deadlock Tracker. This was also how people were getting information about their quote-unquote MMR. So there's been this phenomenon through Twitch streams and YouTube content and all of that sort of stuff, where people will post videos top 1%, top 0.1% MMR, highest MMR lash, highest rated, all that sort of stuff. And the reality is just that information isn't public. If you go onto the Deadlock client, you're not able to find any of that information. And the websites like this are doing approximations, right? They're trying to take in a bunch of data, and they're using their own developed MMR sort of algorithm to try to piece together what they think your MMR could be. So I think a lot of that stuff was do we want there to be this perception that there's this super elite pro level gameplay happening in these top percentile matches right now? Or I think really what this is just a chill the fuck out button. You know what I mean? I think it's okay, this is an alpha. We are in a period of heavy iteration and heavy, development. There's really no other way to say it. The game is changing very rapidly. The type of feedback that we're looking for right now is, are you having fun? Is this stuff fun to interact with? Are you enjoying not only presenting problems for other players, but are you enjoying trying to solve the problems that other players are introducing? And that's really it. Questions of balance kind of be damned right now. Another thing is in this most recent patch, Viscous got a pretty heavy nerf, right? He got a bunch of changes to his 3 because, in particular lobbies where people were playing Viscous really, really well, they were able to abuse the ability to basically harass and force people out of lane. But, if you're a player who, isn't at the level where they're like conceptualizing all of this stuff for themselves, and you're just looking at a website like this to try to interpret the data, you're like, okay, Viscus has a pick rate of 35%. It's one of the lowest in the game, only lower than, or the only one lower is Mo and Krill. And he's got a win rate below 50%. Like, why are we nerfing this character? Right? So I think this type of data, like, while of course it's going to be useful eventually, the reality is that a website like this really is not super useful right now. And I think Valve knows that. And so rather than letting their player base be influenced by a bunch of data that is just not particularly constructive, you know, they don't want people coming at them and being like, Vindicta is too weak, Paradox is too weak. They want to like have people play the game and then try to come to their own conclusions about this type of stuff, right? So that's sort of my interpretation. I think as time goes on, obviously this is going to get lifted and then we're going to be able to see some of this data again, but I would expect if it's not by like an open beta, it would probably be by the time that we have a proper ranked mode, so that there's no need for this like proxy MMR system, and you're able to actually sort this data by like the rank of players, so that you're able to get a more solid interpretation of like what good players are doing, rather than just like having a bunch of data that's like great talents are picking the highest rated build and losing, right? Basically, this will be re-enabled once there is the nuance available for this information to be usable again. Until then, I think they're just looking for more baseline data and feedback from their player base. But you let me know what you think. I really appreciate you watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one, all right? Peace.